In March of 2018, Toys R Us announced it would liquidate its entire US business. 33,000 workers would lose their jobs. Workers who had spent 10, 20, 30 years with the company would leave with whatever their last paycheck covered. 3 private equity firms had owned Toys R Us for 13 years. In that time, they extracted approximately $470 million in management fees from the company. During the bankruptcy proceedings, the company sought approximately $16 million in executive retention bonuses. After secured creditors were paid, nothing remained for workers. Severance for 33,000 employees was zero. This is the story of how an $11 billion toy empire was acquired, loaded with debt it could never survive, and systematically extracted until there was nothing left. And what happened to the people who built it when the money ran out? Charles Lazarus was 25 years old when he opened a baby furniture store in Washington, D.C. in 1948. The store was called Children's Bargain Town. It sold cribs, high chairs, strollers, everything a new parent needed. Within a few years, Lazarus noticed something. Parents who bought furniture from him bought it once, but the same parents kept coming back to buy toys, because as children aged, their interests changed, and new toys replaced old ones every single year. Furniture was a one-time transaction. Toys were a recurring purchase. Lazarus converted his store to toys. In 1957, Children's Bargain Town became Toys R Us. It was one of the first stores in the country built entirely around the idea of selling toys in volume, at low prices, in a warehouse-style format. It worked. The company went public in 1978. By the 1990s, Toys R Us operated more than 1,500 stores worldwide, employed over 70,000 people, and generated $11 billion in annual revenue. Geoffrey the Giraffe was one of the most recognized retail brand characters in America. The jingle, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid," ran for 3 decades. For an entire generation of American children, Toys R Us was not a store. It was a destination. Birthday trips, Christmas mornings spent cataloging exactly what to ask for. The store where the newest Nintendo was in stock when everywhere else was sold out. Lazarus had built something that genuinely mattered. What happened to it next was decided without him, and without the 70,000 people who showed up every day to keep it running. Here is what the 2005 deal meant for the people who worked there. Every toy Toys R Us sold from that point forward, every holiday rush, every clearance sale, every birthday gift carried out in a yellow bag, had to generate enough to service a debt the company's new owners had placed on it. The workers who showed up every day had no say in that decision. Most of them had no idea it had been made. They were employees of a company that had just been restructured in a way that made investing in itself almost impossible. In July of 2005, 3 private equity firms, KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty Trust, took Toys R Us private in a leveraged buyout valued at $6.6 billion. The acquiring firms contributed approximately $1.3 billion of their own capital. Toys R Us was required to borrow the remaining $5 billion, not by the buyers, but against the company's own assets. The debt went on the company's balance sheet. The company then serviced that debt out of its own cash flow. The stated plan was modernization. Toys R Us had been struggling against Walmart and Target, which were selling toys at near zero margins to drive foot traffic to their broader stores. KKR, Bain, and Vornado said they would renovate the stores and build a competitive e-commerce platform. The restructuring, they said, required patience that public market investors would not allow. What the restructuring actually required was approximately $400 million per year in interest payments. That is, $400 million every year that could not go to store renovation, could not go to technology, could not go to building an e-commerce platform capable of competing with Amazon. It went to the banks that financed the acquisition. And then there were the management fees. Beginning when the deal closed, KKR, Bain, and Vornado charged Toys R Us fees for their oversight and advisory services. By the time the company filed for bankruptcy 12 years later, those fees totaled approximately $470 million. The debt stayed, the fees were collected, and in the background, something else was happening. A separate decision made 5 years before KKR ever arrived, one that would seal the company's fate. In 2000, 5 years before the private equity firms arrived, Toys R Us signed a deal with Amazon to become the exclusive toy retailer on Amazon's platform. No other toy seller would be permitted on the site. Amazon violated the agreement almost immediately by allowing other toy sellers to list products anyway. Toys R Us sued. In 2004, a New Jersey court ruled in their favor and terminated the contract. But here is what that 4-year lawsuit actually cost. While the case was active, Toys R Us had no reason to build its own e-commerce platform. They were legally entitled to receive that from the market leader. By the time the contract was terminated, Amazon had become the default toy marketplace. The window was already closing. When KKR, Bain, and Vornado acquired the company in 2005, building a competitive e-commerce operation from scratch was exactly what was needed. It was also exactly what $400 million per year in debt service made impossible to fund. The stores aged. The website went underfunded. Every year, Amazon, Walmart, and Target captured more of the market Lazarus had built. By September 2017, there was nothing left to work with. What came next happened fast. On September 18, 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Eastern District of Virginia. The company carried $5 billion in debt at the time of filing. The stated objective was reorganization, not liquidation. Management told employees, suppliers, and the public that stores would remain open through the restructuring process. The announcement sent a signal that proved impossible to contain. Customers who might have shopped at Toys R Us for the 2017 holiday season assumed the stores were closing and bought elsewhere. The holiday quarter, the quarter the company needed most to demonstrate to potential acquirers that the brand still had commercial value, collapsed. No buyer materialized, no refinancing was possible. The debt load had no viable path forward. In January of 2018, the company announced it would close all 735 remaining US stores. The bankruptcy that was supposed to save Toys R Us was about to become something else entirely, and the people with the most to lose were about to find out what the system had decided they were worth. The liquidation announcement came in March of 2018. All US stores would close. All 33,000 US employees would lose their jobs. Workers who had spent decades with the company had one question: what happens to us? The answer came through the bankruptcy process. In a Chapter 11 proceeding, workers are classified as unsecured creditors. They stand behind the secured lenders, the banks and bondholders, when assets are distributed. At Toys R Us, after the secured creditors were paid, nothing remained for workers. Severance for 33,000 employees was zero. Not reduced, not deferred. Zero. The Federal WARN Act requires companies to give workers 60 days advance notice before a mass layoff. Workers filed an adversary complaint inside the bankruptcy proceedings, alleging they had received as little as 1 to 2 weeks' notice before their termination date, and in some cases, none at all. The complaint stated those workers had been deprived of the specific protection Congress created the WARN Act to provide: time to find new employment, arrange health care, and prepare financially before the income stopped. A group of former employees organized. They called themselves the Toys R Us Workers Action Group. Among those who testified before the United States Senate was a former employee who had worked at Toys R Us for 32 years. She told senators she had dedicated her career to the company, that she had expected to retire from it, that she had received nothing. During those same proceedings, the company sought approximately $16 million in executive retention bonuses, payments described in court filings as necessary to retain personnel whose expertise was needed to maximize value during the restructuring. The executives were being offered retention payments. The workers had been classified as unsecured creditors in the same bankruptcy, the same one that had no severance for 33,000 people. The WARN Act suit settled in 2019 for approximately $20 million, split among thousands of former employees. Individual payouts ranged from a few $100s to a few thousand after years of litigation. KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado lost the equity they had invested, but they had already collected $470 million in fees. Their balance sheets did not reflect the same outcome as the workers they had employed. Charles Lazarus, the man who had turned a baby furniture store in Washington, D.C., into the defining toy retailer in American history, died on March 22, 2018. He was 94 years old. The liquidation announcement had come 3 weeks earlier. Toys R Us was not the only retailer that went through this. Sports Authority, Payless Shoe Source, and Sears all followed the same arc. Private equity acquisition, debt load, hollowed-out operations, bankruptcy, workers left with little or nothing. The workers who testified before Congress contributed directly to the passage of the New Jersey WARN Act in 2019. 90 days advance notice and severance pay for qualifying mass layoffs, significantly stronger than the federal standard. At the federal level, senators introduced the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which would have made private equity firms liable for the debts and pension obligations of the companies they acquire. It has not passed. The brand has been partially revived. A small number of Toys R Us locations reopened in 2022, primarily as shops inside Macy's stores. The name, Jeffrey the Giraffe, the brand assets, purchased out of bankruptcy, now a licensing property. The $5 billion in debt is gone. The 33,000 workers are gone from the brand. The $470 million in management fees were paid and kept. None of that changed. Now let's talk about this in the comments. KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado acquired Toys R Us in 2005. They placed $5 billion in debt on the company's balance sheet. They charged approximately $470 million in management fees over 12 years. The company paid roughly $400 million per year in interest, capital that could not go to stores, technology, or the people working in them. In 2017, the company filed for bankruptcy. In 2018, it liquidated. 33,000 workers received zero severance. The three firms had already collected their fees. That is the sequence. Was that theft, or is that just how the structure works? Tell me where you draw that line. And second, workers with 30 years of tenure were classified as unsecured creditors and paid nothing. Executives in the same bankruptcy proceedings received retention payments. Should bankruptcy law protect workers before it protects anyone else? What would that actually require? Drop your answer below. Subscribe to Blunder. We cover the collapses they'd rather you forget.